Welcome to ECO351, Study Session 3, Specific Factor Model. Introduction. In the previous study session, we demonstrated that international trade can be mutually beneficial to the nations engaged in it. In this study session, we will incorporate income distribution into the picture of trade analysis, learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Discuss the features of specific factor model. 2. Analyze the relationship between resources and relative supply under the specific factor model. Specific factor model. The specific factor model was developed by Paul Samuelson and Ronald Jones in 1971. This model bears similarities with the Ricardian model. For instance, it assumes an economy that produces two goods and labor are allocated between the two sectors that produce the two goods. However, the model departs from the Ricardian world by extending factor production beyond one. Not only that, the model assumes that a factor is specific to the production of a particular good. Also, labor is homogeneous and mobile. That is, one of other factors, say capital, can only be used in the production of a particular good, while labor can move across industry. To fix idea, assuming Nigeria can produce two goods, oil and agriculture. The country has three factors of production: natural resources, land, and labor. Oil is produced using natural resources and labor, but not land, while agriculture is produced using land and labor, but not natural resources. Hence, labor is a mobile factor that can be used in either sector, while natural resource and land are both specific that can be used only in the production of one good. The production of oil therefore depends on the amount of natural resources and labor used, while the production of agriculture depends on the amount of land used. Thus, the production function of each sector can be specific as follows: QO equals to QO of R and LO, and QA equals QA T and LA, where QO and QA are output of oil and agriculture respectively, and LO and LA are amount of labor allocated to oil and agriculture sector. The model also assumes full employment, and therefore total labor in the economy must be exhausted by the two sectors, that is, LO plus LA equals L. Properties of the production function. Natural resources and land are specific to oil and agriculture, respectively, while labor can shift from one sector to another. We assume that the specific factor is in fixed quantity, so that it is the shifting of labor that determines output mix. If labor shifts from oil to agricultural sector, output of the agricultural sector will increase. But since there is a fixed land, it means that as labor shifts from oil sector to agriculture, agriculture output increases at a decreasing rate, indicating that the production function exhibits diminishing marginal returns. It can also be the case that labor are moving from agriculture to oil sector, and by the same token, the production function of oil sector also exhibit diminishing marginal returns. Figure 3.1 below shows the slope of marginal product of labor, which measures the additional output generated by adding one or more labor to work in agricultural sector. It is possible to also relate marginal product of labor to labor input. We know that given a fixed area of land, increase in labor input in agriculture sector will reduce the marginal product of labor in agriculture sector. Thus, there is an inverse relationship between marginal product of labor and labor input. This is demonstrated graphically in figure 3.2 below. When the quantity of labor in agriculture sector was LA1 in the graph, marginal product of labor was MPLA3. When labor shifts from oil to agriculture and increase agriculture labor supply from LA1 to LA2, marginal product of labor declined to MPLA2. When labor increased to LA3, marginal product of labor fell to MPLA3. Let us consider the case of oil sector. Let us assume that labor shifts from agriculture to oil sector as noted earlier. This will lead to increase in oil output. But as more and more labor move to work in a fixed natural resource of oil sector, oil output tends to increase at a decreasing rate. The production function of oil sector, which relates output to labor supply, is given in figure 3.3. The same explanation for figure 3.1 applies to figure 3.3, with slight modification that we are referring to oil sector instead of agriculture sector. The relationship between the marginal product of labor in oil sector also has the same shape and similar explanation as in agricultural sector. In particular, figure 3.3 is similar to figure 3.1, and figure 3.4 bear the same similarity with figure 3.2. Also, the same explanation is given for both, only that why figure 3.1 and 3.2 explains the properties of production function in agricultural sector, that of figure 3.3 and 3.4 explain properties of production function in oil sector. The next step is to try and derive the production possibility frontier. Recall that the production possibility frontier shows the pattern and what the economy is capable of producing. In our economy, where through goods, oil, and agricultural products are produced, the production possibility frontier shows the pattern and amount of oil and agriculture that can be produced given land, natural resources, and labor available. Specifically, the production possibility function shows the amount of oil to be produced given the amount of agriculture produced. The production possibility function is derived from amalgamating the entire four graphs above. This is demonstrated in figure 3.5 below. Quadrant 1 shows the production function of agriculture, while quadrant 3 shows that of oil. Quadrant 4 shows labor allocation among two sectors. This line is negatively sloped. indicating that if labor increases in oil sector, it will lead to decrease of labor in agricultural sector. Now, when labor is shifted from oil, say from point 2 to point 3, the extra input will increase output in agriculture sector by the marginal product of labor in agriculture, MPLA. What this implies is that to increase agriculture output by 1, labor input must increase by 1. However, each labor shifted from oil sector will reduce oil output by the same amount of marginal product of labor in oil, that is MPLO. That is, increase in agricultural output by 1 unit will reduce output of oil by the MPLO divided by MPL of A. Consequently, the slope of the production possibility curve becomes minus MPL of O over MPLA. Prices, wages, and labor allocation. In the earlier section, we showed how output is determined given the allocation of labor. In this section, we shall concentrate on how labor is being determined. That is, we shall determine how much labor will be employed by each sector. In a perfectly competitive market, the demand for labor depends on the price of output and wage rate. The higher the wage rate, the lower the labor demand. The higher the unit price of output, the higher the labor demand. Meanwhile, wage also depends on combined demand for labor in the two sectors. Our knowledge of microeconomics informs us that a profit maximizing employer will continue to hire labor until the value of an additional output produced is equal to the market wage. The value marginal product is obtained by multiplying marginal product of labor by the output price. Thus, the wage paid in the agriculture sector becomes MPL of A times P of A, which gives us wage rate of agricultural sector. Since MPLA slopes downwards, MPLA multiplied by PA will also slope downwards. Thus, equation 3.1 is the demand curve for labor in agriculture. Thus, I tell you that again, that is, demand for labor rises with decrease in wages and falls with increase in wages. By the same token, if wages in oil sector falls, labor demand will rise, while if it rises, labor demand will fall. That is, MPLA multiplied by, I take that again, MPLO multiplied by PO equals WO. Since labor is mobile, it will seek for the sector that pays higher. As labor shifts to the high-paying sector, other sectors will experience scarce labor, and this will push wages up in the sectors. This in turn will create incentive for labor to move to that sector. This process will continue until a particular wage, which will create no incentive for labor to move from either sector, is reached. This type of wage established by the forces of demand for and supply of labor is called the market wage or the going wage, or technically the equilibrium wage. The equilibrium wage in the economy can be established by combining figures 3.4 and 3.5. The outcome is presented in figure 3.6 below. Relationship between labor allocation, relative price, and output. The horizontal axis is the total labor supply. The left side graph shows the value marginal product of labor in oil sector, which is equivalent to demand for labor in oil sector. The right side graph shows the value marginal product of labor in agricultural sector, which is the demand for labor in agricultural sector. The intersection of the value marginal product of the sector gives the equilibrium wage. Point V on the horizontal axis gives the appropriate labor allocation to each sector. In particular, at the equilibrium wage rate, labor demand by oil sector is OV, while labor demand by agriculture sector is VO. From the graph, we can establish the following relationship. MPLO times PO equals W, or VMPLO equals W. MPLA times PA equals W, or VMPLA equals W. Equating W equals W, we have MPLO times PO equals MPLA times PA. Divide through by MPLA and then by PO to get MPLO over MPLA equals PA divided by PO. If we consider the fact that VPLI, YI equals OA is downward sloping, then they will carry negative sign such that minus MPLO over MPLA equals minus PA over PO. 3.8 shows an important relationship between the relative prices and output. Equation emerging from allocation of labor. Precisely, the equation says that the production point, the slope of production frontier, given by MPLO over MPLA, should be tangential to the slope of the relative price. What does this mean? Let us use graphical exposition to get a clear picture of what we are trying to say here. Look at figure 3.7. The production possibility frontier line slopes downwards and its shape is determined by MPLO divided by MPLA. Relative price line is tangential to PPF at point E. This point shows the amount of oil and agriculture to produce. For instance, at that point, QO amount of oil will be produced together with QA amount of agriculture. It follows that if PO and PA changes, the slope will change and respective output will also change. Note that the way output changes depend on whether the changes in prices of oil and agriculture are the same or differs. Let us assume that the price of oil and agriculture each rises by 5%. Proportionate increase in price. The graph below informs us about how labor allocation, output, and prices would look alike. Figure 3.8 shows that with each increase in commodity prices, labor allocation remains the same. Output also remains the same, but there is a new equilibrium wage that is higher than the earlier one. Thus, when there is a proportionate change in relative price, no real change will occur. Now consider a disproportionate change in relative price. Assuming that oil prices rises by 5%, while agricultural price rises by 7%. This implies that agricultural price is 2% higher than oil price. Figure 2.9 shows what will happen. Because of higher price in agriculture, labor will shift from oil to agriculture, and this will shift the marginal product of labor in agriculture to the left. Relative price and distribution of income. Having examined the production possibility frontier and how relative prices relates to output through allocation of labor, we turn to how this affects income distribution. In the diagram below, an increase in agricultural price to the tune of 7% leads to an increase in output less than 7%, say 4%. This implies that if oil prices rises by 5% and agricultural prices rises by 7%, we should expect wage in agriculture to rise by say 4%. What will be the effect of this change on owners of resources, that is land, labor, and resources? Workers in agricultural sector find out that their wages increases, but less than increase in the price of agriculture. 7% increase in price and 4% increase in wages. Thus, their real wage has fallen in terms of agriculture, but it has actually risen in terms of oil. Thus, we cannot say a priori whether workers in agriculture are better off or worse off. We need more information about their preferences for the two goods in their consumption basket. If they consume more of oil than agricultural goods, then they are relatively better off. If they consume more of agricultural goods than oil, then they are relatively worse off. What of owners of resources? A shift of labor to agriculture reduces oil output and reduces the usage of natural resources. This will reduce payment for usage of natural resources. Thus, in terms of price of oil, owners of natural resources would definitely be worse off. What about the landowner? Increase in the price leads to less increase in wage, and therefore owners of land are definitely better off. In sum, in the specific factor model, owner of a factor that is specific to the production of a particular good gain if there is a disproportionate upward increase in the output price of goods for which the factor is specific, while the other owner will lose. Owners of labor may gain or lose depending on their preferences. International trade and specific factor model. Let us consider trade between Nigeria and Indonesia. For trade to take place, the two countries must have different relative price of agricultural goods that would prevail in the absence of trade. Price differences may occur for at least two reasons. First, if the countries have different relative demand, that is, the demand for agriculture by Indonesia may be higher than Nigeria's. Second, if the countries have different relative supply of agricultural goods, that is, if Nigeria produces more quantities of agriculture than barrels of oil relative to Indonesia. To fix idea, we shall assume that consumption differences are not the basis for trade. That is, relative demand in both countries are the same. In this case, given the relative price PA over PO, each country will consume oil and agricultural products in the same proportion. Consequently, they will have similar relative demand curve and therefore trade is not a function of demand condition. We therefore focus on how differences in relative supply causes international trade. Relative supply differential may occur as a result of differences in technologies or differences in resources. Since we are not in the Ricardian world, we shall assume that differences in relative supply is caused by differences in resource endowment. Relationship between resources and relative supply. Consider Nigeria having abundant land area relative to Indonesia, whereas Indonesia has abundant natural resources relative to Nigeria. Clearly, Nigeria should produce a high ratio of agriculture to oil at any given price, while Indonesia should produce high ratio of oil. Now, assuming that the area of land cultivated increases, what effect would these have on the production and labor allocation? This situation is shown in figure 2.10 below. Increase in cultivated land increases labor productivity in agriculture and shift the marginal product MPLA to the right from MPLA multiplied by PA equilibrium to MPLA multiplied by PA equilibrium 2 at a given relative price. Increase in demand for labor in agriculture shifts equilibrium wage from E asterisk to E asterisk 2. More labor will be drawn from oil sector to agriculture, and this will raise agriculture output. Increase in cultivated land increases labor productivity in agriculture and shift the marginal product MPLA to the right from MPLA times PA star to MPLA times PA star at a given relative price. Increase in demand for labor in agriculture shift equilibrium wage from E star to E star star. More labor will be drawn from oil sector to agriculture, and this will raise agriculture output. Increase in agricultural goods occur for two reasons. First, workers have increased in number in agriculture sector and they have more land to work with. Second, output of oil will fall because workers have reduced. Thus, for any given relative price, an increase in the cultivated area of land will increase agricultural output and decrease oil output. In Indonesia, with increase in the discovery of natural resources, demand for labor will increase in the sector, and this will increase oil production. Thus, given relative price, increase in natural resource in Indonesia will increase oil output and decrease agricultural product. Consider Nigeria and Indonesia having the same labor force, but Nigeria has larger supply of land while Indonesia has supply of natural resources. We can graphically demonstrate that the relative price of agriculture will be higher than world relative price of agriculture in Nigeria, while the relative price of oil will be higher than world's in Indonesia. This is presented in figure 3.11. Nigeria's relative supply of agriculture and oil lies above and to the right of Indonesia's. This is so because with large area of land and less natural resources, Nigeria produces larger quantities of agricultural product and relatively little oil at any relative price. The converse is the case in Indonesia. With the same relative price, what relative demand is each country's demand curve. Thus, when both countries open up to trade, world output lies between the autarkic output. Also, the world relative price lies between the pre-trade prices. Hence, trade has increased agricultural price in Indonesia and lowered it in Nigeria. That is, PA divided by PO is less than TOT less than PA divided by PO, where TOT is terms of trade. Relationship between prices, production, and consumption. Consider a situation of no trade. By assumption, what Nigeria produces will be what it consumes. The same applies to Indonesia. International trade makes it possible for the mix of agriculture and oil consumed to differ from the mixed produced. However, even though there exist consumption and production differences, a country's consumption depends on the income level. That is, the value of production will be PA times QA plus QO times PO equals PA times DA plus PO times DO. PA times QA minus PA DA equals PO DO minus PO QO. PA QA minus DA in the bracket equals PO, then DO minus QO into bracket. Then DO minus QO equals PA over PO multiplied by QA minus DA in bracket. The left side of equation 3.3 gives the Nigerian imports of oil, while the right side gives the relative value of Nigeria's export of agriculture. Thus, equation 3.10 tells us that import of oil by Nigeria equals the product of agricultural export and the relative price. One insight from this equation is that the economy cannot import more than what it can export. The equation is usually called the economy's budget constraint. We can repeat equation 3.3 and 3.10 for the case of Indonesia. In this case, Indonesia's import demand for agricultural product is the product of relative price and net export of oil. We can use the budget constraint of Nigeria and Indonesia to construct how the equilibrium trade will look like. The graph below shows the picture. Panel A is the Indonesia's output, budget constraint, and consumption choices, while panel B shows that of Nigeria. Indonesia produces QIA but consumes at DIA. Thus, they export DIA minus QIA, amount of agriculture, and export DIO minus QIO, amount of oil. Thus, Indonesia becomes an importer of agricultural products and an exporter of oil. The opposite is the case in Nigeria, where Nigeria becomes an importer of oil and an exporter of agriculture. At equilibrium, Indonesia's export must exactly equals Nigeria's imports, and Indonesia's imports must be Nigeria's export. Income distribution and gains from trade. Thus far, we have established the fact that production possibilities are determined by resources and technology. We have also seen how relative price dictates choices of production and how a change in relative price affects the real income of different factors of production, and finally how trade changes relative prices. The next line of action is to examine the gainers and losers in trade. To do this, note that without trade, Indonesia will have low relative price of agriculture. After trade, the relative price of agriculture rises in Indonesia. Thus, owners of natural resources will be better off in Indonesia. The welfare of workers is ambiguous, while owners of land is worse off. In the case of Nigeria, without trade, low prices of oil, and after trade, the relative price of oil will rise. Hence, owners of land are better off, while owners of natural resources are worse off. Again, the after-trade welfare effect of labor is ambiguous. What this implies is that trade benefits the factor that is specific to the export sector of each country, but hurts the factor that is specific to the import competing sector, with ambiguous effect on mobility factors. Summary. In this study session, you were exposed to the specific factor model, which allows for a distribution between general purpose factors that can move between sectors and factors that are specific to particular uses. In this model, differences in resources can cause countries to have different relative supply curves, and thus causes international trade. Mobile factors, in this case labor, that tend to work either in any of the sectors, may either gain or lose depending on the preference for products. This is the end of study session 3. Thanks for listening.